Bio 139 lectures. This video is on cardiovascular system and we are going to learn about the anatomy of heart. Our heart is made up of two side-by-side pumps. There is a right side pump and a left side pump. The right side, it receives oxygen poor blood from the body. That oxygen poor blood, it contains carbon dioxide, and heart pumps that blood to the lungs. This is known as pulmonary circuit. The left side, it receives oxygenated blood from the lungs, and the heart pumps this blood to the tissues of the body. This is known as a systemic circuit. Let's look at these two circuits. This is the right side of the heart. The blood is coming in from the body tissues, and this blood contains carbon dioxide. It comes in the right atrium. From the right atrium, it goes to the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle pushes this blood to the pulmonary artery. Any vessel which leaves the heart, which goes away from the heart, is known as artery. It does not matter if it has oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood. So pulmonary arteries, they contain deoxygenated blood and they take it to the lungs. In the lungs, the carbon dioxide is removed and oxygen is added to the blood, and then this oxygenated blood, it comes to the left side of the heart, and the vessel which carries it to the left side of the heart is known as pulmonary veins. So these pulmonary veins, they take the blood to the left atrium. Left atrium pushes it into the left ventricle, and then left ventricle contracts and pushes the blood into the aorta. And through the aorta, the blood goes to the all the tissues of the body. So this is known as systemic circuit. This is our systemic circuit, and this is our pulmonary circuit. So this is the simple form. Like on the right side, the blood is coming from the body tissues and going to the lungs, and on the left side, the blood is coming from the lungs and going to the body tissues. Now let's go over the anatomy of the heart. Our heart, it is around the size of a fist. So if you can make a fist of your hand and then put it across your sternum and the upper part between the second rib and the fifth rib. So this is approximately the size of the heart, and it extends from the second rib to the space between the fifth rib and the sixth rib. This is where we can feel the apical impulse. So our heart, it lies in the mediastinum. Mediastinum is the middle part of the thorax. On each side of the heart, there is a lung, and it lies behind the sternum. Sternum is the bone in the middle of the thorax. This muscle is known as diaphragm. The base of the heart, it is resting on the diaphragm, and the lateral surfaces of the heart, there a small part is covered by the lung border on each side. Now let's look at these vessels. This is pulmonary trunk. Although it is on the left side, but it is coming from the right ventricle. And this is aorta. It is coming from the left ventricle, and this superior vena cava, it is bringing blood from the body into the right atrium. Our heart, it is enclosed by a membrane that is known as pericardium. Pericardium means around the heart. Peri means around, cardium means heart. It is a double-walled sac, and it is made up of two layers. The superficial or the outer layer is known as the fibrous pericardium. Fibrous pericardium is tough and it functions to protect the heart. It also anchors the heart to the surrounding structures, and it prevents the overfilling of the heart because it is not a very stretchy layer. Then inside the fibrous pericardium, we have the serous pericardium. Serous pericardium is made up of two layers. There is an outer parietal layer which lies under the fibrous pericardium. Then there is a visceral layer. Visceral layer is also known as epicardium because it is present on the external surface of the heart. In between the two layers, there is a cavity which is known as pericardial cavity. There is a fluid in this cavity, and that fluid prevents the friction between the two layers. This is fibrous pericardium, the outer part of the pericardium, and then under the fibrous pericardium we have the serous pericardium. So this is the visceral layer. which is present close to the heart. It is known as epicardium, and it is integral part of the heart wall. And then this is the parietal layer of the pericardium, which is present under the fibrous pericardium. And if you want to understand these two layers of the serous pericardium, just imagine if someone puts their hand inside a balloon. So the inner layer is the visceral pericardium, and the outer layer is the parietal pericardium. What can go wrong with the pericardium? If there is inflammation of the pericardium, it is known as pericarditis. Remember when we did the inflammation slide, we said that inflammation, if some disease it has itis in the end, it means there is inflammation. For example, appendicitis, tonsillitis. Similarly, pericarditis. Itis means there's inflammation of the pericardium. What happens because of the inflammation? That the serous membrane surface, it becomes rough, and then now there is pericardial friction rub, and it can also lead to adhesions in which the visceral and the parietal pericardia, they stick together, and now they hinder the activity of the heart. Then there is another condition known as cardiac tamponade. In cardiac tamponade, in severe inflammation, there is too much fluid present in the pericardial cavity, and that fluid, it can compress the heart and limits its ability to pump. So this fluid has to be removed. We discussed the covering of the heart. Now let's come to the layers of the heart wall. There are three layers. Epicardium, which is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. We already went over it. Then there is myocardium. Myocardium is the muscular layer. And then there is endocardium. Endocardium is the inner endothelial layer. Inside the epicardium, there is myocardium. Myocardium, it is mainly composed of the contractile cardiac muscle. We know cardiac muscle, it is contractile, and then it is branching. So these branching cardiac muscle cells, they are attached to each other through connective tissue fibers, and then they are present in interlacing bundles, and this effectively links all parts of the heart together. What is the significance of this? It is that the heart, it contracts as one muscle. In this way, it efficiently pushes the blood into the vessel. So this myocardium, it consists of contractile cardiac muscle, and it makes the bulk of the heart. This is the thickest layer of the heart. And then there is another part in this myocardium. It is cardiac skeleton. What is cardiac skeleton? It is a network of connective tissue fibers. They reinforce the myocardium. They support the heart valves, and they provide electrical insulation between the areas of the heart. Now, the innermost layer of the heart is the endocardium, and it is a sheet of squamous epithelium, endothelial cells, which is resting on a thin connective tissue layer, and it lines all the chambers of the heart. It covers the fibrous skeleton of the valves as well, and endocardium is continuous with the endothelial lining of the blood vessels leaving and entering the heart. Our heart has four chambers. Now let's see the internal features. There are four chambers. There are two atria which are present superiorly, and then there are two ventricles which are present inferiorly. Between the two atria, there is a septum which separates the atria. It is known as interatrial septum. And there is a feature on that interatrial septum which is known as fossa ovalis. Fossa ovalis is kind of an oval depression, which is the remnant of the foramen ovale of the fetal heart. Then between the ventricles, we have interventricular septum. It separates the two ventricles. So the internal features are two atria, two chambers, and then two ventricles, two chambers inferiorly. So we have four chambers, and then we have two septa, interatrial septum and the interventricular septum. This is right atrium, and this is left atrium. So we cannot see, but if the heart is closed, there will be an interatrial septum present between them. And then these are the two ventricles, right ventricle and the left ventricle, and you can see the interventricular septum, right? Let's look at the surface features of the heart. Two grooves are visible on the surface of the heart. They indicate the boundaries of the four chambers, and they also carry blood vessels supplying the myocardium. So we can see a coronary sulcus. Coronary sulcus, it separates the atria and the ventricle. It is also known as atrioventricular groove. Then we have anterior interventricular sulcus. It is the interior position of the interventricular septum, and posteriorly this continues as posterior interventricular sulcus, and both of these, they have vessels in them. This is coronary sulcus or atrioventricular sulcus, and this is on the back side. You can see this is coronary sulcus, and there are vessels running in it. So it is atria are present above and ventricles are present below. So on the anterior surface, this is anterior interventricular sulcus, and at this point under this will be interventricular septum, and it continues as the posterior interventricular sulcus, and you can see there are vessels running in them. Atria, the receiving chambers, they are small, thin-walled chambers, and they have appendages which are known as auricles. Auricles, they increase the atrial volume, so their auricles are present on the right atrium and also on the left atrium. Let's see what is inside right atrium. Right atrium, as you know, it receives deoxygenated blood from the body. Its interior portion is smooth walled, and posterior portion contains ridges formed by the pectinate muscles. And where the pectinate muscles and the anterior smooth part they meet, this is known as crista terminalis. So this is this foramen ovale. It is in the interatrial septum. This is not in the floor of the right atrium. This is the interatrial septum, and then this is like the auricle of the right atrium, and you can also see pectinate muscles over here. Three veins, they empty into the right atrium: superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. Coronary sinus, it returns blood from the coronary vein. And the left atrium, it receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. Pectinate muscles are found only in the auricles, and four pulmonary veins, they return blood from the lungs. This is our left atrium. So the pectinate muscles are only present in the auricle. We cannot see auricle in this diagram. There are four pulmonary veins, two left pulmonary veins and two right pulmonary veins. So these pulmonary veins, they are opening in the left atrium. They open in the left atrium, and then this is our right atrium. Let's go over it again. It has a smooth part, and then posteriorly there are pectinate muscles. If you look closely at this gut part, you will be able to see the ridges, and where this smooth part and the pectinate muscle they meet, that is known as crista terminalis. And this fossa ovalis, it is present in the interatrial septum between the right and the left atrium. And this is superior vena cava. It is opening in the in the right atrium, and this is inferior vena cava. It is also opening in the right atrium. This is how it appears in reality. So this is pectinate muscles. This is crista terminalis. This is fossa ovalis. And here you can see this is opening of the inferior vena cava. This is opening of the coronary sinus, and this is superior vena cava. We cannot see its opening over here. So we already discussed what is written on this slide, so let's move ahead. Now let's go over the ventricles. Ventricles, they are the discharging chambers, and they make the bigger portion of the volume of the heart. And right ventricle, it makes the interior surface of the heart, and the left ventricle, it is present more postero-inferiorly, so it makes the postero-inferior surface of the heart. And then there are some features which we can find on the inside of these ventricles. These are trabeculae carni. What are trabeculae carni? They are irregular ridges of muscles on the ventricular walls, inside the ventricular walls. And then another feature inside the ventricular walls, we have papillary muscles, and then these papillary muscles, they anchor the chordae tendineae that are attached to the walls of. Let's find these features inside this diagram. So these are the ventricles. This is the right ventricle. It is present anteriorly and it makes the anterior surface of the heart. And this is the left ventricle. It makes the posterior surface of the heart. And now these ridges you can see, these are known as trabeculae carni. These ridges are trabeculae carni, and then these are the papillary muscles, and to these papillary muscle the chordae tendineae of the valves, they are attaching. Let me show you here, it is more clear over here. So these are the trabeculae carni, okay, inside, and then these are the papillary muscles, and these chordae tendineae of the valves, they are attached to the papillary muscles. This is interventricular septum, right, which we can see over here, and then this is right atrium and this is left atrium. This is from cadaver. So this is our right ventricle, and this is our left ventricle, and you can see these are known as trabeculae carni, these kind of muscle fibers over here, and then these are the papillary muscles, and to these papillary muscle, these chordae tendineae, they are part of the valves. They are like fibrous projections from the valves. They are attaching to the papillary muscles. Similarly, on the right side, you can see this is the papillary muscle, and this valve chordae tendineae, they are attaching to the papillary muscle. And this vessel which is leaving the right ventricle, this is the pulmonary trunk. It carries the deoxygenated blood. So just notice the relationship of pulmonary trunk to the aorta. It is present anteriorly to the aorta and more to the left side. And then this vessel, this is aorta, it is coming from the left ventricle, and this takes the blood to the all the tissues of the body. And this is an elastic artery. We will talk more about it when we do the arteries. In this diagram, we can see the anatomical difference in the right and the left ventricle. The left ventricular wall, notice it is more thicker, and it is more, the lumen is more circular compared to the right ventricle, because the left ventricle, it pushes blood into the systemic circulation, which is the resistance in the systemic circulation, it is far more compared to the pulmonary circulation. So this right ventricle, it pushes blood into the pulmonary circulation. Now let's go over the blood supply of the heart. Blood supply of the heart is known as coronary circulation, and it is the shortest circulation in the body, and it is the heart, it receives its blood when it is relaxed, not while it is contracting. And the left ventricle, it receives most of the coronary blood supply. So in coronary circulation, we have a left coronary artery and a right coronary artery. Both of them, they arise from the aorta. Left one goes to the left side and the right one goes to the left side. The left coronary artery, it has a circumflex artery and an anterior interventricular artery. And the right coronary artery, it has right marginal arteries and then posterior interventricular artery. We cannot see in this slide. And the venous return of the heart. So the coronary veins, the capillaries in the myocardium, they join to make the cardiac veins. Those cardiac veins, they drain into the coronary sinus, and then that coronary sinus, it drains into the right atrium. So the contributing veins to the coronary sinus are the great cardiac vein, the middle cardiac vein, and the small cardiac vein. There are also several anterior cardiac veins that empty directly into the right atrium. We have heart valves present in the heart, and these valves, they are present between the atria and the ventricles, and then between the ventricles and the vessels. These valves, they ensure that the blood, it flows only in one direction through the heart, and they open and close in response to pressure changes. The two major types of valves are atrioventricular valves, which are located between the atria and the ventricles, and the semilunar valves, which are located between the ventricles and the major artery. It is important to notice that there are no valves present between the major veins and the atria, because the inertia of the incoming blood, it prevents the backflow, and also heart contractions, they compress the venous openings. So the problem of backflow is not present there. So let's look at this diagram. So we have two types of valves, the atrioventricular valves. We have two of them, one on the right side, one on the left side. Then we have semilunar valves, which are between the ventricle and the vessels. So the right atrioventricular valve is known as the tricuspid valve because it has three cusps. And the left atrioventricular valve is known as the bicuspid or the mitral valve. And these valves, these atrioventricular valves, they are attached through the chorda tendineae. Remember, we saw these chorda tendineae. So these are like these extensions from these valves, which are known as chordae tendineae, and then they attach to the papillary muscles in the ventricular valve. So just imagine these are papillary muscles. So this attachment, this prevents the eversion of the valve during ventricular contraction. When the heart is relaxed, these AV valve flaps, they hang in the ventricular chamber. So these are, let me just try to draw. When it is relaxed, the heart is relaxed, so the valve is falling into the, these are the cusps of the valve, and they are like attached to this chordae tendineae, and it means that this valve is open, so blood is just flowing from the right atrium into the right ventricle. But when the ventricles, they contract, the pressure rises against inside the ventricle, and then these and the blood pushes these valves upward and they close. So now the blood, it cannot go back into the right atrium. So this is on the right side, and similarly on the left side it happens the same, that when the left ventricle also contracts, the valve closes, the mitral valve, it closes. Now the blood cannot go in the left atrium. Now the other type of valves are the semilunar valves. These are the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. So their names are the same according to the vessels. So when the ventricles contract, interventricular pressure rises above the pressure in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, and semilunar valves are forced open and their cusps are flattened. When ventricles are relaxed, the blood flows backward towards the heart. It fills the cusps and closes the valve. Let's see how these valves, they appear in life. So this is like they have cut a section from here. So you can see this is our tricuspid valve. You can see the three cusps. So this is present between the right atrium and the right ventricle. This is bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. It is present between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Then this is the aortic valve. This is semilunar aortic valve. Remember, I showed you that aorta actually it appears behind the pulmonary trunk, and this is the pulmonary valve, and this is how they are going to appear in real life in a cadaver. All right. So now let's go over the atrioventricular valves. We already discussed their features. They are almost the same. They are written in this slide. So we have two atrioventricular valves: the tricuspid valve or the right AV valve. It is made up of three cusps and it lies between the right atria and the ventricle. Then the mitral valve, the left AV valve, it is bicuspid. It means it is made up of two cusps and it lies between the left atria and the ventricle. Then chordae tendineae, they anchor the cusps of the AV valves to the papillary muscles that function to hold the valve flaps in closed position, and they prevent flaps from everting back into the atria during ventricular contraction. So this is a heart valve. These are chordae tendineae. They are attached to the papillary muscle. So if you look over here, this is tricuspid valve, and these are the chordae tendineae coming from the tricuspid valve, and they are enforced to the papillary muscle over here. And similarly on the right side, this is mitral valve, and then these are the papillary muscle. If you see, you can see small these chordae tendineae attaching to the papillary muscles. And also notice the the left ventricle has a thick wall and the right ventricle has a thinner wall, so its muscular layer is more on the left side. All right. Now let's go over the function of the atrioventricular valves. So over here, the blood returning to the heart, it fills the atria, okay, on the both sides, in the right atrium and in the left ventricle, in the left atrium. And when it enters, it presses against the AV valves. The increased pressure, it forces the valve to open. So now the blood, it is coming in the atria, and it is also some part of it is going down into the ventricle. As the ventricle, now the ventricles are also filling. As the ventricles fill, AV valve flaps, they hang limply into the ventricles. Then atria contract, forcing the last of the blood, the additional blood, into the ventricles. So same happens on the left side. So direction of flow of blood is from the atria to the ventricle, and this is where the valve is open. Now let's go to this next slide. Now what happens? The ventricles, they contract, right? So first the atria contracted and they push the last of the blood into the ventricles. Now the ventricles contract. When ventricles contract, the force of the blood, it pushes the valve up, and the AV valves, they close, and the papillary muscles, they contract, and chordae tendineae tighten, preventing the valve flaps from everting into the atria. So this happens both on the left and the right side. So now we have blood in the atria, in the ventricle, sorry. We went over these two valves, and our blood is in the ventricles. Now let's see what happens to these two valves, because as these valves close, these valves are going to open. The valves between the ventricles and the great vessels, they are known as semilunar valves. There are two semilunar valves, and they prevent backflow from major arteries back into the ventricles. They open and close in response to pressure changes, and each valve consists of three cusps that roughly resemble a half moon. Pulmonary semilunar valve, located between right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic semilunar valve, it is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. Now let's see what happens to these valves then when the ventricles contract. So as the ventricles contract and interventricular pressure rises, the blood is pushed up against the semilunar valve, forcing them to open. So this you can always also see here, these semilunar cusps, they are open, and the blood is going into the vessels on both sides. Imagine on both sides, in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. And as the ventricles relax, the intraventricular pressure, it falls. Blood flows back from the aorta towards the heart, towards the ventricle, and this closes the semilunar valves. Now, what can go wrong with the valves? Number one, the valves can be incompetent. If they're incompetent, the blood, it backflows into the heart. So the heart, it repumps the same blood over and over again. And what happens if these valves, they become too constricted? It is known as valvular stenosis, in which the flaps, they become very stiff and they constrict the opening. And then now heart needs to exert more force to pump the blood. To sum it up, let's go over the pathway of blood through the heart. So on the right side, three veins, they are bringing blood into the right atrium. They are superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. So now the blood is in the right atrium. From the right atrium, there is a valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle that is known as tricuspid valve, and through that valve the blood, it goes into the right ventricle. Now the right ventricle, it contracts. When it contracts, the tricuspid valve, it closes, and the pulmonary valve, it opens. So the right ventricle, it pushes the blood through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk, it takes the blood and it divides into pulmonary arteries, and then pulmonary arteries, they take the blood all over in the capillaries in the lungs. Now after that blood, it has been oxygenated in the lungs. Now let's see what happens on the right side of the heart. Four pulmonary veins, two on the left side and two on the right side, they bring the oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left atrium. Now between the left atrium and the left ventricle, there is a bicuspid valve, which is known as mitral valve. Through this valve, the blood goes into the left ventricle. Initially, it just flows itself because the valve is open, because the ventricle is relaxed. At the last part, the left atrium, it contracts to get all of the blood in the left ventricle. And when the left ventricle, it starts to contract, the mitral valve, it closes because of the force of the blood, and the aortic semilunar valve, it opens. Aortic valve, semilunar valve is present between the left ventricle and the aorta. So left ventricle, it pushes the blood into the aorta, and aorta takes it to the systemic circulation. So there is an animation video available on your Pearson text. I want you to watch it. Now let's go over the same thing which I did without the diagram. You can go over it in this diagrammatic form as well. I will not go over it again because I already said it. So there are some important points about the differences and the similarities. So equal volumes of blood are pumped to the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. Pulmonary circuit is short, low pressure circuit. Systemic circuit is long, high friction circulation. Anatomy of ventricles, it reflects the differences. That is why the left ventricle, it is thicker than the right ventricle, because the left ventricle has to work against the force, whereas right ventricle, it is pushing blood into the low pressure circulation. Let's go over cardiac muscles. Cardiac muscles are short, striated, branched, and interconnected. They contain one central nucleus, or at the most two nuclei, and they contain large amount of mitochondria. And then they have sarcomeres, and their sarcomeres have Z discs, A band, and I band. All are present. I put this diagram here just to remind you. This is the I band, where only the thin filaments are, and this is the A band, which is mostly the thick filament, and the thin filament, when they slide, they come here too. And then this is the Z disc. Okay, so all of these features are also present in the cardiac muscles. And then there are T tubules, and they enter at the Z disc. So one T tubule per Z disc. And sarcoplasmic reticulum is simpler than in the skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle cells have a special feature. They have intercalated discs. What are intercalated discs? They are connecting junctions between the cardiac cells, and they have desmosomes. Desmosomes, they hold cell together. They are a type of a junction, and they prevent cells from separating during contraction. And then they have gap junctions. Gap junctions allow ions to pass from cell to cell, so the adjacent cells, they are electrically coupled. And because of this, the heart, it acts as a functional syncytium, and it contracts in a coordinated coordinated movement. Between the cells in the intercellular spaces, there is connective tissue matrix. This is known as endomysium, and it contains the capillaries. And then the cardiac cells, they are attached to the cardiac skeleton. Remember, we did cardiac skeleton initially, that there is a connective tissue cardiac skeleton. So this cardiac skeleton, it gives them a support to pull against. Now let's revise all those features on these. So this is how they appear under the microscope. See, these are branched cells. Cardiac cells are branched. They have 1 or 2 nuclei per cell. And then they have sarcomeres. They are not very prominent here as they are in the skeletal muscle, but they do have them. These dark lines are known as intercalated discs. And these dark lines, because of these intercalated discs, the cardiac cells, they are attached to each other. And these intercalated discs, they contain gap junctions. Gap junctions, ions can move from one cell to another in the gap junction. So they are electrically connected to the adjacent cell. Then they have desmosomes. Desmosomes are these structures, these joints, and they keep the myocytes from pulling apart. Okay, let me just revise a few points. So these are cardiac myocytes, and they have like 1 or at the most 2 nuclei per cell. And then they have lots of mitochondria. And then they have a sarcomere. The sarcomere has I band, A band, and Z disc. Okay, and they have sarcoplasmic reticulum with T tubes. And they have 1 T tube per Z disc, which is less compared to the skeleton muscle. And then they have this is a nucleus, and then they have sarcolemma, the outer membrane covering. Let's look at the differences of skeletal muscle cell and the cardiac muscle cell. So how are skeletal muscles and cardiac muscle similar? So muscle contraction is preceded by depolarizing action potential both in cardiac muscles and in skeletal muscle. And then depolarization wave travels down the T tubules, causes sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. And then excitation, contraction, coupling occurs. The actin and the myosin, they interact and the contraction occurs. Calcium binds troponin, causing filament to slide. So there are some differences between the skeletal and the cardiac muscle. So one of the most important differences is that in cardiac muscles, there are 2 kinds of myocytes. There are contractile cells, like the ones I described just before. They have some similarities with the skeletal muscle and some differences too. And then there is another kind of cell which is known as pacemaker cell. This is a non-contractile cell that can spontaneously depolarize. So the cell can depolarize itself spontaneously, and it can initiate depolarization of the entire heart because the cardiac myocytes, they are interconnected through the gap junctions. So they can depolarize without stimulation from the nervous system. So this does not happen in skeletal muscle fibers. So there are some special cells in the cardiac muscle. They are known as pacemaker cells, and they have the property of spontaneous depolarization. So what are other differences? Heart, it contracts as a unit, whereas skeletal muscles, they contract independently. We just went over that all the cardiomyocytes, they are attached to one another at the intercalated disc, and in the intercalated disc we have gap junctions. So the ions can move from one cell to another through the gap junctions. As a result, all of the heart, all the cardiomyocytes, they contract as a single unit. This is known as functional syncytium. So there is all contract or non-contract, all contraction or non-contraction. And this contraction of all cardiac myocytes, it ensures effective pumping action, that all of the blood at one time it is pumped into the artery. If different parts of the heart are contracting at different times, this will not happen. So the other difference is that when in the cardiac myocytes, depolarization, it opens slow calcium channels in the sarcolemma, and this allows the calcium to enter the cell. extracellular calcium then causes sarcoplasmic reticulum to release its intracellular calcium. So it is different from skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles, they do not use extracellular calcium. Then another very important difference is that tetanic contractions, they cannot occur in cardiac muscles. So cardiac muscle fibers have long absolute refractory periods than skeletal muscle fibers. Absolute refractory period is almost as long as the contraction itself, and this prevents tetanic contractions. It allows the heart to relax and fill as much as needed to be an efficient pump, because if the heart cannot relax, it will not be able to fill. So the purpose of contraction of heart will be lost. So that's why there are no tetanic contractions in the cardiac muscles. So cardiac muscles, as we just read, that they have more mitochondria than the skeletal muscle, and so they have a greater dependence on the oxygen. Cardiac muscles cannot function without oxygen. Skeletal muscles, they can work without oxygen as well. Both tissues can use other fuel sources, but cardiac is more, in fact, cardiac is more adaptable to other fuels. But for cardiac cell, the oxygen has to be present. Now this table summarizes all of the differences we went over. You can revise this table to revise all the differences.